Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so if you guys want to come a little closer, I would appreciate it if you didn't get right in front of the camera, but if you come a little closer, I'll go over this very quickly and we'll get started and have some fun and get you guys working on this really quickly. Yes, please bring perfectly good bringing a stool. Bringing a stool, leaning up against the thing, whatever you want to do. So, if there's anything that I would say about watercolor, is that watercolor is all about bringing pigment to a surface. This is any kind of, it's related to paint, all kinds of painting, but you're bringing the pigment to a surface. And what you have to sort of stay involved with at all times is the idea that water as a medium allows you to control a lot, but unlike water, water is very, very thin in comparison to a lot of other paint materials we could use. Now, we worked with that last week, and I showed you, you don't always have to be doing runny watercolor. Remember, we were looking at the idea of it being the consistency of tea, just water with a little bit of pigment in it, and then a little stronger and heavier, where you begin to get something that's a little bit more like milk, or skim milk, or cream, right? It can be fairly thick, and then it can be extremely thick, almost like the consistency of honey, to borrow from Mark Caro Holmes out of Montreal. So, as we do that, we get different kinds of mark making qualities. The brush handles differently when it's got thick paint versus when it's got thin paint. And when it's wetter and thicker, you can put it down on something that's wet and it runs, but it's got a soft edge and doesn't run a lot. But if it's a very wet surface and you put really wet color in it, it just runs all together and you can't tell the difference. Though you might get some nice explosion-y things happening. Sometimes people will call these cauliflowers or explosions or back runs or anything like that. It has to do with the viscosity of the paint and the water sort of interacting. So, to begin making marks, that's great, but what if when I want to fill an area? There's a word for that. It's making a wash, okay? So, if I need to fill an area in with a wash, the question is how do I do that? If you're a standard painter painting a house, you might think if I'm going to fill an area, I might want to do a flatter brush. And that makes some sense. You don't have a roller, I'm sorry. That would be nice, but so I'm just going to come over here and pick up some color. Well, there it is, fairly runny, right? Can you see that okay? Would that make it better if I did that? Can you still see okay? Okay. I don't mind doing that because that gives me that tells me where my dirty water is. Right here, my clean water's there. So now I got a thin, runny bit of color. And if I want to fill in an area, and a lot of times I'll put a pencil line down because it's nice to sort of make yourself work with a specific area. Okay. Immediately, it's not even. I put it down over here. The brush is wetter here. Notice there's a little streak in there because the paint wasn't completely all over the place. But, immediately I've got a problem if I think I'm going to be making filling something in. Now, that's a little better. A little more even pressure, but notice there is an area that's wetter here. It's drier on this side. If I'm going for something like a square, I've got a streak going on. I've got some streaks up here. Now, I know what we would do for painting a wall. There's no question what we would do with painting a wall. We go this way. We go this way. We'll go back and forth. The problem with this way of getting it, and there's nothing wrong with this. It's essentially wrong. But the thing is, every time I touch the piece of paper, every single time I touch the paper, when it's wet, little tiny bits of paper are floating up into the paint. When it dries, they will not be on the surface anymore. They'll be above the surface. You won't spot it, but they're going to cast a shadow. They will make the paint, they'll also begin to, those fibers will begin to give up some of their methylcellulose, the gluey stuff that holds the paper together, and that will make the paint layer cloudier. Now you won't notice it a ton, but what I would say is, and you put 5 layers of color down on top of each other, and you've done that every single time, you will begin to have a cloudier, murkier, and some people call it muddier color, because you're picking up those little pieces of paper and all that methylcellulose, and then the bad part is methylcellulose is a glue, gum arabic is a glue. What do you think is going to go around in all the dust particles in the air that come floating by are going to get trapped as well. So that's another thing that's going to give you a problem. So generally, while I am quite willing to do this, notice I did it basically 3 times, 4 or 5 times. You're talking, it's going to start to be messy if that becomes your normal approach. So my normal approach is this: touch the paper as few times as you can. If that scares you because you might think I have to be perfect, watch this. You ain't going to be perfect. I am not, I shall not, I will not, I cannot be perfect. But I'm putting some more paint in. The other problem you've got here is, notice there's also this little extra bit down here. So I'm going to talk to you about how to play with that. I'm going to do it again. This time I'm going to do something a little differently. I'm going to try to touch very lightly at the beginning, because when I first touch it, a lot of paint wants to run out. But if I try to pay attention, see how it's thicker in the middle, picking up some more paint so that it's fairly even. Notice how I'm going over the edge so that they're running together a little bit. Now I'm going to leave it alone, because see, now each of those strokes is different. This one's a little lighter at the beginning, it's a little heavier here, it's still wet. It starts to run out of paint over here. Here, similar, but it really ran out here. And here it's thicker here. Apparently I picked my brush up a little bit and then I pressed it back down. So that's uneven. Notice what's going to happen here. I'm going to end up with stripes. Is that a problem? Well, if you're not painting an American flag or not painting a sign that's got stripes on it, you might not like that. If that's your friend's face, you probably have issues. Your friend might have issues. You might be okay with the stripes. It's okay. But you see immediately that can be an issue. Okay. So maybe I shouldn't be using a flat brush. Maybe I should be using a different brush. The truth is, there is no magic brush at work here. Pick up my oldest one, my 35-year-old brush that no longer has a nice fine point on it. You might think, okay, if I'm going to do a rectangle, how am I going to do that? Well, you know, I'm going to do a rectangle. I might come in and say, okay, well, I'm going to do a rectangle. And I'm going to fill it in very quickly. Now that's problematic. It's not even, but at least it's not stripy. It's kind of nice. It's not that it's not striping, but it's not quite right either. Okay, try it one more time. Making it a little wetter. A little bigger. Now, one of the things that happens here is it's uneven. Now, if the paper wasn't puckering a little bit, we would end up with a situation where the paint's going to stay fairly flat. But almost every sheet of paper you're using, this is a 140-pound paper. It is not super heavy, but it is not super light either. That's why I recommend it. It's a middle paper, as opposed to 35 or 45 or 70 or 90-pound papers, which get really waffly really fast. So and the paint, because it's water, it's trying to be even. One of the things that happens is you get these little spots here, like remember how it was wet and darker here? But as the paint began to dry, this stayed wet, and then you might not have spotted it because you were busy over here. Then it was so wet here, this was damp. And what happened is the water tried to break out, and it did, but it pulled some of the paint with it. It also pushed paint off the surface, and so now we've got this little dark ring here and a little dark spot in the middle. And we're going to probably end up with something like that here. See, it also happened. Can you see here this little bit of an explosion that happened right here? So the trick is to keep it fairly even. Now, do we always need a completely flat wash? 90% of the time you don't need a perfectly flat wash.
When you say flat wash, do you mean uniform?
A uniform,
okay.
Flat color. Most of the time we don't need that, but we want it when we want it. I have a friend of mine who was a brilliant painter. She's gone now. She was much older than I was, but she was always doing machinery. She had a love affair with old, rusted farm and industrial machinery, whether it was on the farm or in a factory. And then she really fell in love with old pre-transistor radios, the tubes, all those little things, not the printed circuitry, but all those other things. And she loved to take an old radio or an old television or an old piece of electronics and paint the inside. So it was flat things and curved things. And she was perfect at getting perfectly flat and perfectly curved color. And it just drive most people crazy because it was so industrial. And then she would interrupt that with the rusted parts or the electrical burned out parts where they would have melted. And it's like so cool to look at their stuff. But she was always looking for very, very flat. Now, I'm going to show you more about that later on, doing larger washes. And because there is a very ancient technique for doing it, and you don't do it flat. You do it at about a 38 to 55 degree angle. And what you're using is using gravity to help you do it. And if you listen to the people who are telling you how to do it, you need to understand they're going to tell you how they do it. I actually had one guy who was speaking one time, and he said, it needs to be at a 43 degree angle, and your water should be at so-and-so temperature, and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, no, I'm sorry. You're doing what you think you have to do, how you've made your life work. Because the temperature of the water makes a difference, but so does the temperature of the air. We know what else makes a bigger difference? The moisture in the air, how humid it is. Because then the paper is going to react differently because it's going to absorb water or not. And how you mix your paint makes a difference because if you make it thicker, you might need it to be more vertical to drag it down better. But, that was his approach. So I'm going to try to give you a more generalized approach. But here we go. Look at these. They're not terribly bad, but I can see a white streak around the outer edge. I can see a little bit of that streak here and some explosion stuff happening here. Certainly stripy. Certainly got this problem here. But in general, these are relatively flat washes. Or they're aiming at being flat. I'll tell you this right up front. The lighter the color, I've heard students and teachers say this, the lighter the color, the easier it is to get a flat wash. And my response to that is no. What it's easier to do is not notice it's uneven because it's so light. But here's the things that you will probably do. I just rinsed my brush out. I'm getting it done. Learning to come back in and gently touch the puddle, not the paper too much. And then just barely touching the puddle, pulling some color off. Then coming back in and making some slight changes while it's still wet. Will help. This is not to say that is perfect. There's a little darker over here, it's a little darker on this edge, a little extra right here. I picked up a totally different color. I haven't even evened it out in my brush yet. Now here's what makes this one harder. This color right here is more opaque. And that makes it a little harder to make it flatter, though it wants to be. When it's flat and it's opaque, wow, it looks really flat. One of the things I'm doing here is I'm trying to do it so that it's all together in the same basic wetness. But again, here's the situation where I would probably come in and go, okay, it's a little damper in the middle. You are always allowed to turn it, to play with it, even it out a little bit, pay attention to it, of course, come back in. Don't do just what I just did. I just try to dry my brush off on my hand, picking up lanolin oil. I let this dry too long. I can pull color out, but not without getting it too wet. So then that's, see, it's already getting a little explosion-y because I've got a little extra water going out there. This is something we learned last week, though. If you let it dry, then I'm going to do this. Can you do me a favor? Could you just very gently touch that color with your fingers? Can you feel any coolness to the paper? Okay, touch the paper and then touch that. Not much, right? I can feel it over here, but then this has been drying longer. If it's dry, truly dry, and it's not dry until it feels the same temperature as the paper, you can come back in afterwards if you need to and play a little bit. I can wet slightly. Then I can try to even up that color just a bit. It's not going to be perfect. Maybe I can almost make it perfect. But like I said, do we need it? How often do we need it to be perfect? If I'm painting your face, I don't want stripes, but it doesn't need to be flat either, because guess what? There's no more than like this much of any surface that is flat. It's made up of lots of little planes, but okay, you get the idea. See what I mean about this one looking lighter, looking like it's more correct because it's lighter? I remember when, and then the second thing is you really want to see one that's bad? This will show up so much. It's a mixture of the indigo and my violet on the palette. It's darker, it will show every little change. Ooh, I have an extra hair hanging out. There we go. That's what I need. Something else to make life more interesting. This paint is also a little thicker. That makes it more likely to not spread very quickly. But I can't change it now because if I get it more wet in that, I'd have to paint everything just right. So, now, one thing I've heard people ask is, well, what if I wet the paper? That makes kind of sense, doesn't it? If you wet it, the water will help the color move out more evenly. You can see how I've got more color here, and more color in the middle. I might, in this particular moment, that wasn't smart. I cleaned my brush in the wrong place. I might be able to come in here and very carefully, again, trying to touch not the paper. Because if I touch the paper, I'm going to see the paper through it. I just want to come in and sort of just pick up a little of the extra liquid that's in this corner, and a little extra in this corner. If I can just touch the top of the puddle, I can pull a little color out. The problem is if your brush has got too much water in it, then you get that other kind of explosion going in the other direction. Okay, it was apparently a little dry spot. So let me do that. Let me do that idea of wetting the paper first. Well, notice I'm going to do this twice. So here we go. I'm wet the paper. Now if I jump in there right this minute, apparently there was a little yellow in my brush. But I'm just looking to see, what you want to do is you want to make sure it's evenly wet and give it a moment to sort of spread out. And then I can come back in. How about? I'm going to let my paint be a little thicker because it's wet. You can see immediately it wants to run and fill in all the spaces. That's anything like, hey, that might be good. If it runs through there really quickly, it might fill in all the spaces evenly. That might work if you had made sure that the paper had been gotten completely wet, saturated equally everywhere. But it looks like it has some advantages. It seems to be more evenly spread. It wouldn't hurt if it wasn't puckering so much. Yes, I've done that in the middle of the painting sometimes. Now, I tend to paint vertically most of the time. So this works, but it tends to also, it might be a little runny if I'm not careful. But if I need something totally flat, this has some advantages. Notice it doesn't seem to be brushwork, but it does have some irregularities like some of these others would have. The other thing is you're seeing a little bit of filling in the little bits in those little canyons in the paper, because I've got two kinds of paint here. One of them is sitting on the top. The other one's sort of filling in down into those little caverns. I would see that more particularly if I was doing that with this blue. This is a blue that we call, it's ultramarine, and it has a tendency to break into its particles anyway. But the heavier particles if it was traditional ultramarine blue, it's made out of heavy particles of the stone called lapis. But even when it's in synthetic form like this one, those particles are really heavy, and they definitely want to drop into those little valleys a little bit. They'll granulate a little more, whereas other colors are much smoother. So this is good. We get some ideas from this, that you can in fact make it fairly flat. My sky doesn't need to be any flatter than that most of the time, but I can go back over it once or twice if I'm not worried about it. I'm not going to go over it with another color and another color and another color. You can go over it 3 or 4 times when it's wet, and it's not going to be too cloudy for you most of the time. Okay? It's when you put layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and then you've done that kind of that stirring up, particularly when you do it and you start to re-wet the color underneath. That's when it really gets cloudy, and you're pulling stuff up. So, we do want to do that, though. We do want to understand the idea of layering color with this, because it's really fun that I can lay a color down on top of dry color and radically change what the color looks like. I mean, look how different that color is on top of that red, on top of that yellow. Now, right this minute, it's uneven, and I should probably pick up a little, oops, too heavy-handed. See, I told you I shouldn't be painting, right? Too clumsy today. But this is called glazing, putting a color on top of color. And it's really, what you usually do that with is you usually do it with some kind of transparent color. Most of our watercolors are relatively transparent. I do not want to go back over that yellow again, because I'm going to start to pick up the yellow. So you get the idea that I can make a green, I can make a darker orange, I can shift colors simply by layering. And whichever one you put on top will be the slightly more dominant one. Okay? Just a little bit, because your brain knows which one's on top. If it's a pale yellow and a medium blue, the yellow is always going to look like it's the less important color in the mix, but because it's light. But if the yellow was on top, the yellow would be just a touch stronger than the blue, than it is here. So we'll be able to see that. Now, layering, glazing is really, really one of the reasons we want to be able to put a layer down. But you know, you don't have to only be doing that. We can be painting lines over it. But look how different a line looks when it's going over a color versus when it's on white paper. It just has a different feel. So, one of the next things we want to be able to understand is color doesn't have to be there exactly that way all the time. Let's do something here. Something we want to try. Nice, dark, almost kind of mauvey purple. What it is a mixed a warm red and a cool violet. They're neutralizing each other a little bit, so it's a little duller. Okay, this is a little subtle difference there. If I had a cool red like this one and mixed into that purple, it would have been a much more vibrant, kind of brilliant, kind of bright red violet. So I've got this paint here, which is a little thicker. I hoped it was thicker. It's not as thick as I'd like. It's okay. See what I mean about it not being quite as brilliant a color? It's a little duller. It's more of a natural purple, the kind that you might find in a plant in the fall. So I'm letting it dry for a moment. I don't need to do this, but I will because I'm not going to dig one out of my box. I'm at the wrong end. No, I'm not. Okay. You probably notice that some of these have round edges, and a few of them have a little cut section. It's like, what's up with that? It's fun to take your damp brush and pull color off. Notice how it's got a soft edge? But if you do it with a scrape tool, it's a very different kind of technique. You can get it. Imagine you did that a lot in a hurry. You get some really nice textural things going on, but here's the next bit. That's why I've given you this. Not all of you have that kind of a brush thing on the back. It's like having a squeegee. Look at the texture you get. And lastly, let me do it again, slightly differently. A different blue. It's a different color. A different violet. It's more of a purpley one. Nice dark color. So, while it's super wet, it might not give us as much texture, but here's something else. While it's wet, notice when I came through here, see how it got lighter as I came? I don't know if you saw that. Let me do it one more time. And it gets really wet. As I come through, what I'm doing is I'm cutting the fibers of the paper. It's making a little microscopic indentation, so it's got a little valley with open fibers in it, so it's sucking in extra paint. So now I've got this nice dark edge line. And see here, it also sort of pulls stuff in that was drier, so you get a dark line in a lighter violet. So later on, when it starts to dry, you might not get as much mark, making this kind of fun and fun to look at. See how it's lighter? Are you seeing that extra lightness as I do that line? The longer you wait, the more likely that is to happen. This idea goes along with an idea that most folks aren't extremely aware of. But one of the popularizers of modern watercolor was the English during their colonial period. They were having lots of sailing ships with all that rigging. They invented brushes that are very thin and literally have one hair coming out the end. There's a long brush called a rigger for doing rigging, little tiny thin marks. If you look, you'll see one hair coming out the top. You see the one hair sticking out of the top? You load the brush, and you can make marks with it. Normal marks. If I really load it up and get it liquid, and I have a really steady hand, I can actually pick that up and get that one hair to make a mark. That's not the only way they made those thin marks. They also did this. They took their pen knife or whatever little pocket knife they had and were making little rigging lines. Because everybody who was a ship's captain or owned a ship wanted a picture of their ship. You know, that was just normal. And then the English, because they were conquering the entire world, everybody wanted a picture of at least one ship in their house. It showed that they were gentlemen / ladies. You know, they were connected to the world. Their version of the Facebook travel picture, if that makes sense, or the Instagram travel picture. So we can play with the surface a little bit, and I want to show you one or two other things about a wash really quickly, and we're done. And we're going to send you back to making some of these yourself. Oh, nice mauve and purple. I'm going to come back over what I've already done. A wash on top of a wash. I could make it more even if I wanted to, if I was in a hurry, but I'm really not going to worry about that too much. What I really want you to spot is that idea that we were seeing when things are too wet, they get a little explosions happening. If you need it, if you want irregularity for whatever reason, we can make it happen all on your own. You can drop it in, or you can just drop in extras in the place you need it to be. And what's going to happen is you're going to get these competing puddles of water. We're going to be pushing paint around in unequal ways. I have friends of mine who do lots of this intentionally, particularly on lower levels. And then when they begin to get this uneven paint surfaces, so then as they paint on top of it, it gives them something irregular. By the way, different paints will behave with that differently. It helps if the paint begins to dry just a little bit before you put the water in, if you want to control it. But you know, you don't have to put the water in. I'm going to do a second one really fast, and then it's your turn to start playing. It doesn't have to be clean water. It might be this is when you're going to get in trouble with your neighbor. And just see what happens, right? Or mine seems to have a problem. Okay. Not supposed to do that, it's supposed to be a mist. Here we go. See the little tiny dot that happened? Play with it if you want. And remember, sponging is not a bad idea either, just to see what it does. See these little things that are, little white things that are happening? That's probably because I had touched that with my finger at some point and left some lanolin behind. Yep. Either I touched it or the manufacturer's employee touched it. This was a sealed pad of paper. But if you need irregular surfaces, there's all kinds of ways to do it. Okay? If you're the right age, or if you work in theater, doing scenes backstage, sponging is a very normal thing. But if you're the right age, if you were doing houses in the 80s, back when popcorn ceilings were really popular, so were sponged walls. Light color underneath, darker color on the over sponging with a dry sponge. Or, as my wife learned, you can do it backwards and do the dark color first and put the light color in heavy dry version. You're thinking, not my current wife, my daughter is deceased first, my first wife. And beautiful, she did a beautiful bathroom wall with a dark peach and a pale yellow on top. Look, dark peach, pale yellow. Opaque pale yellow, so the pink just sort of come through. So we can play with our surfaces and get, notice I'm basically telling you, you don't have to do flat washes all the time. In fact, one of the kinds of wash, the third kind of wash, attempts at flat washes, intentionally irregular washes, or variegated washes, and the other kind of wash that we actually made last week is kind of the idea of start thick and heavy, and let the brush run out. If it's even, it becomes a graded wash, and I'll show you a little bit how to do that a little bit later. That's very easy to do when you tilt the paper, because then you can build, the gravity will help pull the color down, and then you just put less and less color in, or put more and more color in, and you get very little color becoming a lot of color, or a lot of color becoming very little color. I've got this extra bit down here that it's not helping it any bit, but you get the idea that it goes from light to dark. So the three kinds: flat, graded, and irregular. You're going to get irregular just as easy as you can ask for, so I don't have to tell you how to do it, except I want to give you some extra versions of playing with it. So, what I'd like you to try is, can I borrow the sheet just a second? Yeah. A flat wash, light in value, flat wash, medium in value, flat wash, dark in value, flat wash, glazing in overlapping washes, graded wash, variegated wash, scraped to, scored, scraped, scored, irregular. Just let's play it a little bit, multiple colors, and just try what we're going to get, and then we're going to play with the idea of, we'll make a design using overlapping colors. You guys have probably already looked at this. But just making a design using overlapping colors. Whether they're flat or not, it doesn't matter. Whether they're perfect rectangles or squares. Look, they're intentionally doing what? Non-flat color. Flat shapes, but it's a design. It's not supposed to be a picture of something. We'll use that later. So, you guys, okay? Get started. Have a little bit of fun. It's supposed to be playful. See if my... And one of the concepts that a lot of artists will use and never know they're using grab something. If you were to ask me about the guts of painting, what are the most important thing you can do in painting? And if I was able to break it down into the absolute most essential thing to be able to do, and I'd have to argue with myself for a long time. I've been an academic way too long. I would argue about a million things. It's not my phone, is it? Okay, I'm not worried. Okay, I would argue a lot with myself and then try to come up with something. But the thing that's probably the most important thing that you can do in painting is to understand that probably the single most essential skill is looking at a shape and being able to translate that three-dimensional form or that depth and space onto a flat shape. Little circles, right? Irregular circles. You can tell there's some kind of color mixing thing going on here. Let's not look at that. Don't look at the man behind the curtain right this minute, because that's not where we're going yet. But shape, because this is never a three-dimensional thing. It's a two-dimensional thing. And pictures on a surface are always about two-dimensional shapes. They might indicate a three-dimensional space or a three-dimensional form, but they aren't physically a three-dimensional thing. Well, they are on a microscopic level, but not really. The biggest thing that we can play with is understanding that what we're constantly doing, yes, we use lines, we use textures, we use colors, but we use shapes all the time. I can make a mark with my brush, but if I make a big enough mark, we read it as a shape. Remember when I was making those marks with a wide brush? They were looking like little rectangles or stripes right away. So one of the things I want us to do is to think about this. The shape that we're looking at is often something like this. So I'm going to do a little quick drawing. I'm using my little spray bottle as a subject matter, okay? I'm not going to worry about it being perfect. I don't care. And I have a strange tendency to use a very loose, it's an amalgamation of about 3 or 4 different basic drawing techniques. Gesture drawing, contour drawing, masking / anyway, it doesn't matter. But there's basically several kinds that I tend to roll all into one. But one of the things I almost always am looking for is the set of shapes that I'm playing with. So now I'm going to give you a basic concept that you guys already know. Okay. Looks like I'm drawing it first. I'm making marks. But now I'm filling it in and I'm turning it into a shape. And can you tell me what the shape I've sort of created is?
Circle.
A circle, right? I've created a circle. Great. I've actually created more than one shape. Create a square with a circle inside, right? A hole in the square. Okay. So I see the circle here easily. You see the circle here? Positive shape. positive silhouette of a circle. If I tell you it's a ball, you go, well, it's not a ball, it's just a flat shape. It might represent a ball, but it's, you know, circle, irregular, kind of bumpy, lumpy, but it's a negative one. I'm going to give you one more circle. Have I got a circle again? Can you see the circle? This is a solid silhouette. This is a negative or an empty silhouette. And I would call this one a broken silhouette. And if you want a more contemporary word, it is a hybrid silhouette. It's got elements of both. And it might even be in a situation where I could do the same thing by having a partial circle and maybe that's all I've got right there. Can you still sense a circle? Now, by putting something else like a shadow shape next to it, now I really start to begin to indicate a three-dimensional thing. But a solid silhouette, an empty silhouette, a broken or a hybrid silhouette, and then you can start to get really a lot more suggestive bits and pieces of it. So you can imagine me coming in very quickly and playing with the idea, oh yeah, let's do a silhouette of the bottle. I don't have to have it precisely the same color all over to make it believable. But you get the sense that I'm getting a solid kind of silhouette here, right? There's a drawing of the edges, but it's not intentionally like a drawing you would do with a line. I'm not doing lines, I'm doing a shape. A set of shapes that begin to get close to saying, I've got a bottle. That same concept that we saw down here, I could go around the outside of it, right? You know I can go around the outside of it, so you're don't have to worry about that, right? So here, I can play a more hybrid version of this. I can have to go all the way around. Now, if I break this background up too much, it might be hard to see the shape unless I really, really go most of the way around it. That was poorly done, but you know what? It's the nice thing about watercolor. Scrub it off. I can even allow them to run together. So this is the more hybrid version. Now I'm going to really break it and now finally come inside the bottle. And I'm intentionally pushing our believability issue so that we really see the parts, the bits and pieces enough. When do I break, or what in theater would be called your suspension of disbelief? That's that concept of have I given you enough that you can sort of see it? Oh, look, I got a real explosion of color. Oh no, what do I do? How about if I just simply come in with my brush, which is now drier, pull off some of that color, and maybe I come back in and have I got enough that I can see what I was drawing here, and have I, it's not as easily seen as this one is because it's complicated. It's more broken. It's more of a hybrid. I can break up the outer surface. I can throw color at it, but I do have a sense of a beginnings of that thing being there. So this is a solid, it's a solid positive. That might be a good word to use, a solid positive. This is an empty, or it's a solid empty, meaning it's even. But it's an empty solid versus a positive solid or a filled solid. This is a broken or a hybrid. And then this one is really starting to get hybrid in that it might be harder to see this. But the truth is, if I'm doing a are you dry enough to turn over? You are. I'm doing a scene and I am looking at a cityscape. In some town, some city somewhere. And I've got all these different buildings that are doing something. If I want to paint this, I don't have to paint. That was bad. I got rid of something I wanted to keep, but that's okay. Please lean on things. Nothing wrong with that. You know, if I can paint the sky that's around everything. Right? We're seeing the idea of a background. I could just as easily switch if I wanted to at this point and say, okay, I'm going to paint the shapes of this building here and that one there. I'm actually sort of painting a building that becomes a silhouette for the building in front of it. You know, we're constantly using silhouettes and breaking silhouettes. Let's see. Oh yeah.
When you say making silhouettes and breaking it, do you just mean hybrid?
Yeah, you can very quickly. Our work, we tend to hybridize a lot, more than we think. You know, if I've got a building here that's and another building here, see a little yellow and green going on here. How about? So what I'm actually doing here is I'm actually kind of creating silhouettes of windows and silhouettes of different kinds of structures on this building. So this is a hybrid using of silhouettes for a roofscape, right? You can sort of sense there's buildingness going on here, and you can see empty silhouettes and solid silhouettes, solid empties and solid color ones. And so, you know, where does one begin? Where does the other end? But this is what we normally do in the world. If I'm out doing a painting and I go down to the downtown mall and I'm doing the front of the Paramount Theater with its very distinctive little shape of a sign, I'll paint around that sign. I'll put some colors in the sign. Maybe because I'm painting the people as well, the little silhouettes of people walking along, I'm painting behind them, and then some of them I'm actually going to paint some, a pair of pants on, or a top, a shirt, a color. But I might not paint the whole figure. It might be mostly empty, or it might be mostly color. I might draw one or two lines around something, and then I can turn around, and then the person in front of them is just an empty blank space, and the person behind them is a gray silhouette. And then the buildings, I'll paint a silhouette of a couple of the windows, and then I'll partially do that with a couple of windows. The idea that we don't do usually an entire painting that's a solid this kind of silhouette or a solid this kind of silhouette. We are constantly doing something more like this in our world when we're painting. But painting silhouettes, learning to paint this kind, and then to hybridize them, is a really, really good idea. It allows us to very quickly begin to make things that are kind of complex. Now, let me show you one that's somewhat similar. I want to show you something about it that you might use. I don't have any of these with me, and I should have, but it's okay. So, here's what I'm going to draw. I'm going to draw two things. A bowl with a foot, okay? Interior space. And I'm also going to draw a cup. I'm doing these with lines, and it's going to have a handle. I don't know which way I'm going to draw the handle. Is it going to be behind or is it going to be up front? I'll figure that out in a minute. But the idea that I can draw a cup with a handle, and maybe I see the rest of the world through that handle. Okay? Get the idea? I could paint these in and have a solid silhouette. I could paint all around them and have a solid empty silhouette. Okay? My water is pretty filthy, but you know what? I'm not going to worry about it. Nice gray. How's that? And then I'm going to have another gray that's a little, it's a warm gray or neutral color, and I'm going to get a more blue one over here. I'm not going for pretty colors right this minute. I'm just going for color, lights and darks. A bowl. Outside of the bowl, coming around the outside edge. Sort of like I'm drawing with the edge of the brush. Yeah, I sort of am. Shape. How about the inside of the bowl a little bit? Way too much pink. That's okay. Just a little bit of color. Now I pulled off too much. Am I picky? You give me a sense that I'm picky? Yes, I am sometimes. Oh man. Come on, Hancock, be a little more delicate tonight. Okay, let me try again. I don't care what color I use. Inside the bowl. And around the bowl. Oh, okay, I can do that. Clumsy tonight. I apologize. Makes it hard for you guys to see what I really want you to see. I might need to let that dry a minute so that I can do the foot on the bottom of this bowl. Not too bad. And then, how about I know what I'm doing wrong. I should have switched to a different brush. I'm just not thinking. There are no magic brushes there, but sometimes just the way you're handling things is better if you do something else. So I'm actually doing the tabletop at this point here. So I've sort of silhouetted around it. Nothing exciting by any stretch of the imagination. Let me see if I can't get a get a different brush, Hancock. Some days. I don't even listen to myself. That's bad. Yeah, okay. bad all over the place.
You crush it. Have us watch you do that.
Yeah.
I know. Doesn't help. Someday, I have friends who teach all over the country, and we all talk about the same thing when we get together. It's like, yeah, I was doing a demo. And boy, did I screw up my demo. Then I sent them all home. And then I played the demo, and it's great. But they were gone.
I have a feeling you know what you're doing.
Okay, how about a little left there, and then just a little touch right there. How about, oh, allow me to do one line. And a little left. Can you see a cup? I have not painted a cup. I mean, look at that. That's one shade, one line, another shade, some empty spaces. Where's the cup? It doesn't exist. It's just a group of shapes, but you can see a cup. I will tell you this. If you're walking in the forest, the predatory cat that is afraid of human beings doesn't wait to see the color of your eyebrow or how big and wide your shoulders are. It spots the human silhouette and it hides or it runs away. Unless it's a very large predatory cat, which is not afraid of human beings, and when they're in there, and then they're looking at you and going, lunch! And they don't care what color. They will evaluate more how big you are and how dangerous you look and how do you move and all that kind of stuff. But at first, that animal spots you. That bird in the tree spots the silhouette of the cat on the ground and goes higher. They don't look at that's one of the things that is a survival skill of human beings, is we don't have to see the whole thing to see the whole thing. It is part of our perception, but it allows us to paint, to start painting something this way and then add details to this. But it also allows us to paint something like this and then start adding and subtracting details to make this exciting. Is that making sense? Okay. So what I'd like you to do is to find some things on your table or in the room, or you can turn and look at each other, but you've got water bottles, you've got cups, you've got sponges. You can sponge these, by the way. You know, you can put water down and sponge stuff around with a sponge and a towel. Play with it. See what you can do to kind of begin to get a sense of a shape that may not. So that's one thing we're playing with tonight, is shapes that are pure shapes and then overlapping them and making it a nice design. And also playing with shapes that begin to talk about things, that begin to at least hint at things. There's nothing wrong with, I mean, I love flat abstract design, layered color. That's really wonderful to play with. But then beginning to think about, how do I paint around a flower? Or maybe I paint part of a flower and paint part of the background. Or I paint, or I put a tube of paint out and paint around the shape, you know, and then I paint part of the shape.